The chaos of a Saturday night in the ER was a storm Rose Bennett knew how to navigate. Rain hammered against the windows of the New Orleans hospital, a frantic rhythm matching the beat of her own heart. She moved through the madness like a ghost, a blur of blue scrubs and focused determination. "If you can complain that loudly, you can wait your turn," she told a man with a sprained wrist, her voice sharp but not unkind. Moments later, she was kneeling, her expression softening as she placed a sticker on a little girl's scraped knee. "See? Brave as a lion." That's when the night shifted. Headlights cut through the rain-streaked glass as a black car, sleek and predatory, screeched to a halt at the ambulance bay. The doors flew open. Two men, built like brick walls in expensive suits, helped a third man out. He was tall, leaning on them but moving under his own power, his face a mask of stone. A dark stain was spreading across the sleeve of his tailored jacket. His presence sucked the air out of the room. The low groans and frantic chatter died, replaced by a thick, anxious silence. He walked past the front desk as if it didn't exist, his eyes scanning the space with an unnerving authority. "We don't need the police," one of his men said, his voice a low rumble that was clearly not a request. Rose felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had seen men like him before. Men who lived by a different set of rules, whose injuries were not accidents but messages. Her supervisor, Maria, caught her eye and gave a subtle nod in the man's direction. "Rose, treatment room 3. Laceration on the right arm." She grabbed a kit, the familiar weight of her stethoscope around her neck a small comfort. It was a tool for healing, for order. As she approached, she saw the butt of a revolver tucked neatly into the waistband of one of his guards. It was a symbol of his world, one of chaos and destruction. She pushed open the door to room 3. He was already sitting on the edge of the exam table, shrugging out of his ruined jacket. The wound was a deep, clean gash along his forearm. It wasn't jagged or messy. It was surgical. Precise. A warning. For a split second, the fluorescent lights of the room blurred. The scent of antiseptic faded, replaced by the memory of a different ER, a different night filled with rain and sirens. She saw a flash of her brother's face, pale and still on a gurney, his life bleeding out from a wound that was just as deliberate. The memory was a shard of glass in her heart, sharp and sudden. She blinked, forcing herself back to the present. The man was watching her, his gaze intense, analytical. He was Oliver Hayes. She didn't know his name, not yet, but she knew his type. He thought he was invincible. Rose pulled on a pair of latex gloves with a sharp snap, her movements all business. She would stitch him up. She would fix the damage. But as she met his cold, dark eyes, an unwelcome and dangerous thought surfaced. She wouldn't just be fixing a wound. She would be sending him right back into the storm that created it. And something inside her, the part that still ached for her brother, couldn't stand the thought of it. The silence in the treatment room was heavy, broken only by the quiet snip of scissors and the rustle of gauze. Rose worked with a focused calm, her hands steady as she tied off the last stitch. The man, Oliver, hadn't flinched once. He just watched her, his dark eyes following her every move as if trying to dissect her motivations. His stare was unnerving. It wasn't the pained gaze of a patient, or the flirtatious look she sometimes had to deflect. It was the look of a predator assessing a creature it didn't understand. She felt the ghost of her brother in the room with them, a cold presence at her shoulder. She was patching up this man only to send him back into the same senseless violence that had stolen her family. The thought was a bitter pill she couldn't swallow. "All right," she said, her voice clipped and professional as she taped a clean white bandage over the neat black line of sutures. "Keep it dry. I'll give you a prescription for antibiotics to prevent infection." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. He started to slide off the exam table, reaching for the shirt he draped over the chair. He was preparing to walk straight back out into the storm, both the one outside and the one that had put that gash in his arm. Rose's resolve hardened. She couldn't just let him go. She couldn't watch another man walk out her door to die. She met his eyes, her own gaze unflinching. She didn't raise her voice. She just stated a fact, plain and simple, born from a place of deep, old pain. "Whoever did this isn't finished," she said. The words hung in the sterile air between them. "You walk out that door, you're a target. I don't want you to get killed." For the first time since he'd walked in, the mask on his face cracked. It was just a flicker, a brief widening of his eyes, a subtle tightening in his jaw. It was surprise. Not the kind born from fear, but from genuine shock. He had expected her to be scared of him, or maybe impressed by him. He had not expected her to care about him. He was a problem she had fixed, a task she had completed. Her concern was a variable he hadn't accounted for, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He saw her honesty not as a kindness, but as a complication. A loose end. He stood up fully, his powerful frame seeming to shrink the small room. He buttoned his shirt with his good hand, his movements deliberate and unhurried. For a moment, Rose thought he was going to ignore her, to just walk away and pretend she hadn't spoken. A part of her was relieved. He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the handle. He didn't turn around, but his voice was quiet, absolute, and filled the room with a sudden chill. "You're right," he said. "They're not finished." He turned back to face her, his expression now unreadable, cold as polished stone. "Which is why you're coming with me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was a verdict. Before Rose could even form a protest, the two men who had been waiting outside moved to stand in the doorway, blocking her only exit. Their presence was no longer protective, it was a cage. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped behind bars. She had tried to save him from the storm, and in doing so, she had just been pulled directly into its eye. The drive was a blur of rain-slicked streets, and neon lights bleeding through the dark glass. Rose sat rigid in the back of the black car, the scent of expensive leather and Oliver's cool cologne filling her lungs, choking her. One of his stone-faced guards sat beside her, the other drove. Oliver was in the passenger seat, a silent, imposing silhouette against the city she no longer recognized. Her mind raced, replaying the moment in the treatment room. His words. The finality in his tone. The way the door was suddenly blocked. Fear was a cold, sharp thing in her gut, but beneath it, a hot fury was beginning to simmer. They left the familiar chaos of the French Quarter behind, moving into the grand, sleeping streets of the Garden District. Towering oak trees draped in moss loomed over them like ancient sentinels. The car slowed, turning through a wrought iron gate and pulling up a gravel driveway toward a mansion that looked like it had been pulled from a history book. It was beautiful, but its shadows were deep and unwelcoming. The heavy front door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click that echoed the sound of a cell door locking. The hospital's sterile brightness was gone, replaced by a suffocating opulence. Dark wood paneling soared toward a ceiling so high it seemed to swallow the light. A grand staircase swept upwards into darkness. The air was still and silent, thick with the weight of secrets. Her freedom, something she'd never even thought to question an hour ago, was gone. Oliver led her into a vast study lined with books she knew no one here ever read. He gestured for her to sit in a leather chair that felt more like a throne. He remained standing, a predator in his own domain. "There has been a betrayal within my organization," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "I am dealing with it. But you were seen with me. Attending to me. That makes you a liability." Rose stared at him, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "Your organization? Your betrayal? That has nothing to do with me." "It does now," he stated, as if explaining a simple, unchangeable fact. "Out there you're a target. A way to get to me. In here you are safe." Her simmering fury boiled over. She shot to her feet, her voice ringing out in the oppressive silence. "Safe? You think this is for my safety?" The absurdity of it was staggering. "You had your men block my exit. You forced me into a car. This isn't protection, Mr. Hayes. This is a kidnapping." He didn't even flinch. His gaze was steady, almost bored, as if her outrage was a mild inconvenience. Call it whatever you need to. The result is the same. You will stay here until the threat is gone. His power was absolute, a quiet, crushing force that expected no argument. The battle of wills was over before it began. He had already won. Defeated for now, she let him lead her up the grand staircase to a guest suite. The room was luxurious, with a bed draped in silk and a marble bathroom bigger than her entire apartment. But it felt cold and personal. A gilded cage. He paused at the door. You will not be harmed here, Rose. You have my word. Then he was gone, pulling the door closed behind him. She didn't bother trying the handle. She knew it would be locked. She walked over to the tall windows, staring out at the rain-lashed garden below. She felt utterly trapped, a pawn in a game she never asked to join. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for any detail that didn't feel like it was chosen by an interior designer. On a dark wooden shelf, nestled between a vase and a stack of art books, was a small collection of records. She moved closer, her fingers tracing the worn cardboard sleeves. Etta James. Louis Armstrong. Dr. John. It was a collection of New Orleans jazz, soulful and raw and achingly human. It was the only thing in the entire mansion that felt real. It was a crack in the cold, hard facade of the man who had imprisoned her, a surprising glimpse of a soul she hadn't thought existed. Sleep was impossible. The silk sheets felt like a shroud and the silence of the mansion was louder than the ER on a Saturday night. Rose stood at the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, watching the rain trace silver paths down the glass. She was a prisoner. A well-appointed one, but a prisoner all the same. The fury from earlier had cooled into a hard, cold knot of dread in her stomach. Every shadow in the manicured garden below looked like a threat. A soft click made her jump. The door. She turned, her body tensing for a fight, but it was just him. Oliver stood in the doorway, holding 2 low-ball glasses with amber liquid and a single ice cube in each. He wasn't flanked by guards. He was alone. He walked into the room without a word, his steps silent on the thick rug. He set one of the glasses down on a table near her. It wasn't a command, but it felt like an offering. A truce. You should be sleeping, he said, his voice a low rumble that didn't seem to fit the opulent room. So should you, she countered, her tone sharper than she intended. Don't you have a betrayal to deal with? He ignored her jab, his gaze steady. He took a slow sip from his glass, his eyes never leaving hers. I've been trying to figure it out, he said quietly. What you said back at the hospital. Rose stiffened. It was a simple statement. Nothing is simple, he corrected her softly. You weren't scared of me. You weren't trying to impress me. You just cared. Why? The question hung in the air between them, genuine and unsettling. He wasn't interrogating her. He was truly asking. She looked away from his intense gaze, back out at the rain. The memory of her brother, sharp and painful, surfaced again. Because I've seen where this ends, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I've seen it up close. I lost someone. My brother. She finally turned back to look at him, letting him see the old, raw pain in her eyes. He was killed. By men like you. Men with guns and messages to send. It was senseless. He didn't offer pity. His expression didn't soften. Instead, a flicker of something else crossed his face, understanding. He nodded slowly, as if she had just confirmed a difficult truth he already knew. In my world, he said, his voice low and gravelly, loyalty is the only currency that matters. It's the only thing with real value. When it's gone, he trailed off, staring into his glass as if the answer was swirling in the amber liquid. He didn't need to finish the sentence. She understood. He was speaking of his own loss, a wound just as deep as hers, just dealt in a different coin. His gaze drifted to the shelf where the vinyl record sat. He walked over, his large hand running over the worn spines with a surprising gentleness. He pulled one out, Etta James. He moved to an old turntable in the corner, placing the dark disc on the platter with a practiced ease. The soft hiss and crackle filled the room, followed by the first mournful notes of a saxophone. Eda's voice, full of soul and sorrow, poured into the silence. The music was a bridge between them, spanning the vast, impossible distance that separated their two worlds. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, just listening. He was her captor. She was his prisoner. But in that shared silence, surrounded by the rain and the lonely sound of the blues, they were just two people who understood the devastating cost of a world filled with senseless violence. The morning light was gray and watery, filtering through the tall windows of the dining room. Rose sat before a plate of food she hadn't touched, the silence of the mansion pressing in on her. The jazz music from the night before was gone, leaving a void that felt heavy and expectant. She had slept for a few hours, a restless sleep filled with shadows and the sound of rain. When she woke, a fresh set of simple clothes, gray sweatpants and a soft black t-shirt, had been left on a chair outside her door. The gesture was both considerate and chilling. A reminder that she was being watched, cared for like a prized pet. Oliver entered the room, moving with the same quiet confidence she was beginning to recognize. He was dressed in a crisp shirt, his injured arm held carefully at his side. He looked like a businessman about to close a deal, not a man at war. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the aroma cutting through the stillness. "We need to establish some rules," he said, his back still to her. Rose's hands tightened around her own cold mug. "Rules? You mean the terms of my imprisonment?" He turned, his expression unreadable. "The terms of your safety. I told you, as long as the threat to me exists, you are a target. Leaving here is not an option. Not yet." He took a seat at the opposite end of the long, polished table, creating a deliberate distance between them. "I will ensure no harm comes to you in this house. You have my word." His word. She almost laughed. What was the word of a man like him worth? But then she remembered the look in his eyes when she told him about her brother. The raw honesty in his voice when he spoke of loyalty. He had a code, as twisted as it might be. She saw her opening, not for escape, but for survival. Arguing was pointless. Fighting was impossible. But she would not be a passive victim. She met his gaze across the vast expanse of wood. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "I'll stay." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. He had expected a fight. "But not as your prisoner," she continued, pressing her advantage. She stood up, needing to be on her feet, to feel her own strength. "I need to know what's happening in the world. I want a television with the news. I want books. And I will not be locked in a room. If I am to be here, I will be treated like a person, not a possession." She took a breath, her heart pounding, and delivered her final, non-negotiable term. "I am your guest, Mr. Hayes. Not your property." The challenge hung in the air, sharp and clear. He stared at her, his dark eyes narrowed in assessment. She could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was used to people who obeyed him out of fear, who cowered and begged. He was not used to a woman standing in his fortress, trapped and cornered, who still had the audacity to negotiate the terms of her surrender. A slow, almost imperceptible shift happened in his expression. The cold authority in his eyes was replaced by something else, something she couldn't quite name. It was a flicker of respect. Of intrigue. Her defiance didn't anger him, it seemed to fascinate him. He was a man who valued strength, and she was showing him a kind he had never encountered before. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of control, but she knew she had struck a nerve. The silence stretched, a tense cord pulled taut between them. She refused to look away, refused to be the first to break. This was her battle, and she would not give an inch. Finally, he gave a single, sharp nod. "Done," he said. The word was clipped, final. "You will have whatever you need. You are my guest." It was a victory, but a strange one. She had won the right to be a more comfortable captive. She had surrendered her freedom, but in exchange she had held on to a piece of herself. As he watched her, A dangerous and unspoken current passed between them. He was her captor, the source of her fear, but his reluctant respect made him something far more complicated. And far more dangerous to the walls she kept built around her heart. The deal was made, sealing her fate inside his violent, uncertain world. For 2 days Rose lived in the eye of a storm. The mansion was a bubble of surreal calm. True to his word, Oliver had given her what she asked for. A television in her room played the news on a low volume, a constant, humming reminder of the world she was cut off from. She read books from his library, the words blurring on the page as her mind raced. He treated her like a guest, a strange, silent roommate in a house held hostage by an invisible threat. They ate meals at opposite ends of the long dining table, the clink of silverware the only conversation. The tension was a living thing, coiling in the quiet spaces between them. Late on the second night, she found herself pacing the upstairs hallway, too restless to stay in her room. As she passed the half-open door to his study, she heard his voice. It was different from the controlled, quiet tone he used with her. This voice was raw, scraped thin with a fury so cold it was almost silent. "You tell me how he got that close," Oliver bit out, his voice a low snarl. "He ate at my table. He knew my father." There was a pause. Rose froze, pressing herself against the wall, hidden in the shadows of the hallway. "No. I handle this. I handle him." Her blood ran cold. Him. It wasn't a rival gang. It wasn't a business dispute. The poison was coming from inside his own house. "He was like a brother to me," Oliver continued, the words laced with a profound, aching bitterness that startled her. "And for what? Because they think I'm weak? Too old-fashioned for this city?" He let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "They're about to find out how wrong they are." The line between captor and captive blurred. In that moment, he wasn't just a powerful mafia boss. He was a man who had been gutted by the one thing he held sacred. He was wounded in a way she could stitch, but never heal. Before she could process the thought, the world exploded. A deafening roar ripped through the mansion, followed by the violent, crystalline shatter of 1,000 pieces of glass. The floorboards shuddered beneath her feet. Rose cried out, stumbling back as the heavy wooden door to the study was blown inward, ripped from its hinges. Smoke and the acrid smell of explosives poured into the hall. Oliver was already moving. He burst from the ruined doorway, his face a mask of grim fury. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, pulling her away from the chaos. "They're here!" he yelled over the sudden shriek of alarms. "We have to go. Now!" Adrenaline shot through her, hot and sharp. The gilded cage had been breached. Its walls were closing in, threatening to crush them both. He dragged her past shouting guards and the pop of what she sickeningly recognized as gunfire. They weren't heading for the grand staircase but for a narrow, hidden door she'd never noticed. He shoved it open, revealing a dark, spiraling servants' passage. They plunged down the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the tight space. The mansion that had been her prison was now a death trap. When they reached the ground floor, emerging into a mudroom near the back of the house, Oliver didn't slow. He was heading for a steel door that likely led to the garage. On a simple wooden peg rack by the door hung 2 raincoats, one a simple black, the other a dark gray. It was an instinct she didn't have time to question. While he worked the locks, Rose snatched both coats from the hooks. Her nurse's mind, trained to think practically in a crisis, took over. She shoved the black one into his chest. "Here," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady as she shrugged on the other. He took it without looking, his focus absolute. He threw the door open, revealing not a garage, but the raging storm outside. The rain was a solid wall of water, the wind howling like a hungry animal. The manicured garden was gone, replaced by a churning, violent darkness. He grabbed her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and pulled her out into the night. The safe house was gone. The illusion of control was shattered. They were running, with no destination but away, swallowed by the very storm they had been trying to hide from. The car cut through the flooded New Orleans streets, a dark, anonymous sedan that blended into the stormy night. Rose sat in the passenger seat, the damp fabric of the raincoat cold against her skin. Water dripped from the ends of her hair onto the cheap upholstery. Beside her, Oliver drove with a tense, coiled focus, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers and the distant wail of sirens heading toward the life they had just fled. The explosion replayed in her mind, the roar, the shattering glass, the heat. It wasn't a movie anymore. It was real. The danger wasn't a vague threat, it was a fire at their backs. He finally pulled into the covered parking lot of a motel on the edge of the city, the kind with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that promised nothing but anonymity. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. "You'll stay here," he said, his voice flat, all business. He didn't look at her. "There's a man, Leo, stationed at the end of the hall. He's one of the few I still trust. Don't open the door for anyone else. Don't leave the room. I have a meeting. I'll be back." He was already getting out of the car, his movements clipped and efficient. For a terrifying second, Rose felt a surge of panic at the thought of being left alone. He was her captor, but he was also the only anchor she had in this nightmare. As he handed her a key card, his fingers brushed against hers. They were cold. He looked at her then, his gaze intense, and for a fraction of a second, she saw the weight of his isolation. He was a king with no kingdom, a general with a handful of soldiers, and he was leaving the only person he knew for sure wasn't a traitor in a cheap motel room. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but the moment passed. He just nodded once and was gone, disappearing back into the rain. The room smelled of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. It was a sterile, impersonal box, a world away from the suffocating luxury of the mansion. Rose locked the door, leaning her back against it as her legs finally trembled. She was alone. She was terrified. But as she stood there, dripping onto the worn carpet, another feeling began to surface. She thought of the words she'd overheard. "He was like a brother to me." The raw betrayal in his voice echoed in her ears. He wasn't just fighting for power or money. He was fighting a war against his own family. Hours crawled by. She paced the small room, her mind racing. She couldn't just sit here and wait like a damsel in a tower. She was a nurse. She solved problems. She assessed situations and looked for a course of action. Through the peephole, she could see the guard, Leo. He was young, barely out of his teens, trying to look tough but shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot. He kept wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers. He looked scared. Her professional instincts kicked in, overriding her own fear. She opened the door a crack. "Leo?" He jumped, his hand instinctively going to the gun she knew was hidden under his jacket. When he saw it was her, he relaxed slightly, but his eyes were wide and anxious. "Ma'am," he stammered. "You should stay inside." "I know," she said, her voice calm and even, the way she spoke to frightened patients. "You look exhausted. Have you had any water?" He just shook his head, looking confused. She disappeared back into the room and returned with one of the plastic bottles from the minibar. He took it hesitantly. "It's a long night," she said, leaning against the doorframe. She wasn't prying, just observing. His hands were shaking slightly as he unscrewed the cap. "Yes, ma'am," he mumbled. "Never seen anything like this. Marco, Vincenzo, they were at Mr. Hayes's daughter's christening. It just doesn't make any sense." He was talking to fill the silence, to ease his own nerves. Rose just listened, her expression neutral. "They're getting sloppy, though," Leo added, taking a long drink of water. "Cocky. My cousin, he tends bar over at the Blue Note on Frenchman. He saw Marco in there last night, buying rounds, bragging about how the old man's time was over. Right out in the open." Rose's heart gave a sudden, hard thump. The Blue Note. A detail. It was small, maybe insignificant. But it was something. It was a crack in the enemy's armor. They were overconfident. They were predictable. "You get some rest, Leo," she said softly, her mind already spinning. It's going to be a long night for all of us. She closed the door, the lock clicking softly into place. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But now, it was mixed with something else. A flicker of purpose. She held a piece of the puzzle, a small weapon she had acquired not with force, but with a bottle of water and a kind word. She wasn't just the nurse he was protecting anymore. She was an ally. The motel room door opened so quietly Rose almost didn't hear it over the drumming of the rain. Oliver slipped inside, a shadow detaching itself from the darker shadows of the hallway. He looked like hell. The exhaustion was etched into the lines around his eyes, and a fresh bruise was darkening along his jaw. He moved with a heavy weariness, the weight of his collapsing world pressing down on his shoulders. He didn't seem to notice her at first, his gaze distant as he locked the door behind him. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic mix of relief and fear. He was back. He was safe, for now. But he had brought the danger of the outside world back in with him. "Did you find them?" she asked, her voice small in the quiet room. He finally looked at her, his eyes focusing as if from a great distance. "No. They've gone to ground. They knew we'd be looking." He ran a hand over his face, the sound rough and tired. "They're waiting for me to make a mistake." This was her chance. Her stomach twisted with nerves. It felt absurd, a nurse offering intel to a Mafia boss. But the image of Leo, the scared young guard, pushed her forward. "I know where one of them was last night," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "Marco. He was at the Blue Note on Frenchman Street. Bragging." Oliver's head snapped up. His initial expression wasn't gratitude, it was sharp, dismissive suspicion. "How would you know that?" "Your guard. Leo. He was nervous, so I talked to him. His cousin is a bartender there." She held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "He said Marco was buying rounds for everyone, talking about how your time was over." Oliver let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh. "Bar talk. It's meaningless." He turned away, walking over to the window and staring out at the rain-slicked parking lot. He was shutting her down, shutting her out. Rose's frustration flared. "Is it? Your man said they were getting cocky? That they were being sloppy. Isn't that a mistake?" He went still, his back rigid. She watched him, holding her breath as the seconds ticked by. She saw his shoulders tense, then slowly, very slowly, relax. The detail, her small piece of the puzzle, had clicked into place with something else, something only he knew. He turned back to face her, and the look in his eyes was different. The dismissal was gone. The suspicion was gone. He was seeing her for the first time not as a liability or a captive, but as something else entirely. An asset. An ally. "Marco," he said, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. He sank onto the edge of the cheap motel bed, the mattress groaning under his weight. He looked utterly defeated. "I taught him how to hold his first gun. He was just a kid from the 9th Ward, always getting into trouble. I saw something in him." He was confiding in her. The sudden intimacy was more shocking than the explosion. He wasn't the untouchable Mafia boss anymore. He was a man bleeding from a wound no suture could fix. "He stood beside me at my father's funeral," Oliver continued, his voice low and raw, directed more at the floor than at her. "He was family. Or so I thought." He finally looked up at her, his eyes dark with a pain that resonated with her own loss. "Your world is about healing people. Putting them back together." A grim, hollow look crossed his face. "Now I have to destroy something I helped build. I have to tear him down, piece by piece, before he does the same to me." They moved under the cover of the pre-dawn gloom, trading the anonymous motel for a discreet apartment tucked above a quiet bakery in the French Quarter. From the iron-laced balcony, Rose could hear the distant, soulful cry of a saxophone and smell the sweet scent of baking bread. The sounds of life felt like a cruel joke when compared to the tense, suffocating silence inside the apartment. This wasn't a home, it was a foxhole. For a full day, Oliver was a caged storm. He paced the length of the living room, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in low, clipped tones to the few men he had left. He was hitting walls. Every lead turned cold, every potential safe house was compromised. He was trying to fight a war, but the enemy was a ghost that wore the faces of his friends. Rose watched him from the armchair where she'd been pretending to read the same page of a novel for an hour. She saw the raw frustration coiling in his shoulders, the exhaustion pulling at his features. He was a man of action, of brute force and clear commands. But this problem was different. This was a cancer, growing from within, and he was trying to cure it by punching the tumor. It would never work. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and fear. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was a risk. He was volatile, a cornered animal, and she was about to poke him. But she couldn't just sit here and watch him self-destruct, taking her down with him. "You're doing it wrong," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. He stopped pacing and turned to her, his eyes dark and dangerous. "What did you say?" She stood up, her own fear making her bold. "You're looking at the wound, but you're not diagnosing the disease." She walked toward him, closing the distance between them. "In the ER, when a patient comes in with a dozen confusing symptoms, we don't just start cutting. We ask questions. We look for the source." He stared at her, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "This isn't one of your patients, Rose." "Isn't it?" she challenged, her voice steady. "Your organization is sick. It's dying. So let's diagnose it." She held his gaze, refusing to back down. "Question 1. Who benefits the most if you're gone?" He scoffed. "All of them. That's the point." "No," she insisted. "Who benefits the most? Who takes your seat? Not the soldiers like Marco. The one who gave the order." He was silent, his expression unreadable, but she could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. She pressed on, her confidence growing. "Forget who you thought was loyal. Who was closest to you? Who knew your schedule? Who knew about the mansion's back staircase? Who knew which men you trusted enough to send to that motel?" Her questions were like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and aimed at the heart of the problem. He didn't answer, but he didn't stop her either. He was listening. "Last question," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Think about the weeks before this happened. Who was acting different? Who was showing signs of stress? Or, and this is the important one, who wasn't stressed at all? Who was calm when they should have been worried about the problems you were facing?" Oliver finally moved, but not with the explosive anger she had expected. He walked over to the small dining table and sank heavily into a chair. He stared at the polished wood grain, his world of violent certainties crumbling under the weight of her simple, human logic. He had been looking for soldiers to fight, for traitors to kill. She was showing him a map of their hearts and minds. He finally looked up at her, and the raw power in his gaze was tempered with something new. It was a reluctant, dawning respect. "Vincenzo," he said, the name a rough whisper. "My cousin." He was calm. Too calm. He pulled another chair out from the table. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a command. It was a request. He was no longer just her captor. In the quiet chaos of their shared prison, she had just become his strategist. Rose sat. The simple act felt like crossing a line she could never uncross. The space between them at the small table was no longer a chasm separating captor and captive. It was a battlefield map, and he had just invited her into the war room. The fear in her stomach was still there, a cold, hard stone, but it was now wrapped in a strange, electric sense of purpose. Her survival was no longer about waiting for him to win. It was about helping him win. "Vincenzo," Oliver repeated, the name a curse on his lips. "He manages my shipping interests. He sees every manifest, knows every route." He looked at Rose, his eyes dark with a dawning, terrible clarity. "But he's not a leader. He's a follower. Someone else is pulling his strings. Then we find his weak link," Rose said, her voice quiet but firm. "Everyone has one. Oliver was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the table as he mentally sifted through the faces of men he had known his entire life. "Sal," he finally said. "He runs the books for Vincenzo. He has a weakness for the poker tables on the West Bank. A bad one." The plan formed in the tense silence between them. It was simple, reckless, and their only option. An hour later they were moving through the city's dark, wet streets. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle that slit the pavement and made the neon lights of the French Quarter bleed into shimmering pools of color. Oliver drove a different car, a beat-up sedan that wouldn't draw a second glance. He wore a simple baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, the shadow hiding the sharp angles of his face. It was a flimsy disguise, but it was enough to make him a ghost in the late-night crowds. Rose's heart hammered against her ribs. This was a choice. She wasn't being dragged along anymore. She was a willing participant, walking into the heart of the danger beside the man who had put her there. The thought was both terrifying and strangely empowering. He parked a block away from a smoky, low-ceilinged bar whose windows vibrated with the deep thrum of a bass guitar and the mournful wail of a saxophone. The air inside was thick with the smell of whiskey and desperation. Oliver led her to a small, dark booth in the back, his body a shield between her and the rest of the room. His gaze swept the room once, and then locked. He gave a subtle nod toward a round table in the corner where a group of men were playing cards under a low-hanging lamp. "That's him," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the music. "The one in the gray shirt." Rose looked. She didn't see a gangster. She saw a man drowning. Sal was sweating despite the cool air, his eyes darting nervously from his cards to the growing pile of chips in the center of the table. His movements were jerky, his smile too wide and brittle. He was losing, and he was chasing his losses. "He looks terrified," she whispered back. "He's in deep," Oliver confirmed, his expression grim. "He owes money to the wrong people. Vincenzo has been covering for him." They watched for another 20 minutes as Sal's pile of chips dwindled to nothing. Finally, he threw his cards down in disgust, pushed his chair back, and headed for the exit, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "He'll go to the alley for a smoke," Oliver said, his body already tensing. He started to slide out of the booth, but Rose put a hand on his arm. His skin was warm, his muscles rigid beneath her touch. "Don't threaten him," she said, her voice an urgent whisper. "He's already scared. Scared men are unpredictable. Use the debt. Offer him a way out." Oliver looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. The trust in that simple look was a heavy, palpable thing. He gave a single, sharp nod and slipped out of the booth, melting into the shadows of the bar. Rose waited, every nerve ending screaming. The jazz music felt like a funeral dirge. After what felt like an eternity, he slid back into the booth. His face was a stone mask, but his eyes were burning with a cold, new fire. "You were right," he said, his voice low and tight. "Sal folded in seconds." "What did he say?" she breathed. Oliver leaned closer, the sense of rain and the night clinging to him. His voice was a bare whisper, meant only for her, but it held the weight of a death sentence. "It's not just Vincenzo," he said. "It's all of them. The old guard. His father's most trusted men." He met her eyes, and she saw the raw, soul-deep devastation of a man who had just learned his entire world was a lie. "Every single one of them." The words hit her like a physical blow. Every single one of them. It wasn't a crack in his foundation. It was the complete and utter collapse of his entire world. Rose's mind struggled to grasp the scale of it. This wasn't a mutiny led by one ambitious man. It was a consensus. A quiet, unanimous vote to erase him, made by the very people he had trusted with his life. The drive back to the apartment was a silent, suffocating journey through a city that felt alien and hostile. The jazz music spilling from distant bars sounded mocking. Rose stole glances at the man beside her. The dangerous, controlled Mafia boss who had abducted her was gone. In his place was a stranger, a man so still he barely seemed to be breathing. The life had drained from him, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell gripping the steering wheel. The lines of his face were carved from stone, but his eyes were filled with a terrifying, desolate emptiness. Back inside the apartment, the pretense of safety shattered. The air was thick with his silent, vibrating grief. He walked to the center of the living room and just stopped. He didn't pace. He didn't rage. He stood perfectly still, his back to her, his shoulders slumped with a weight she couldn't begin to imagine. The stillness was worse than any explosion. It was the absolute calm that comes after a fatal wound, the moment before the body understands it's already dead. Rose didn't know what to do. The nurse in her wanted to check for a pulse, to ask him if he could feel his hands. The woman in her just wanted to run. But she stayed rooted to the spot, a silent witness to his undoing. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was tangled with a sharp, aching empathy for the man beside her. Finally, he spoke, his voice a rough, broken whisper that seemed torn from his soul. They were at my wedding. They held my daughter at her christening. Vincenzo, he was my father's shadow. He turned to face her, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes was a wound deeper than any knife could make. He looked lost. Utterly and completely lost. I can fight my enemies, he said, his voice cracking on the last word. I expect it. It's business. It's the game. He took a staggering step toward her, not in threat, but as if his legs could no longer support the weight of his own body. But this is from family. From inside the walls. He stopped just a few feet from her, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. He was fighting a war with himself, trying to contain a pain so immense it threatened to tear him apart. I have one code, Rose, he confessed, his gaze locking with hers, pleading for her to understand. One thing that matters above everything. Loyalty. Betrayal from an enemy is a cost of doing business. Betrayal from your own blood, that is a mortal sin. There is nothing else. He wasn't a monster in that moment. He wasn't her captor. He was a man whose faith had been annihilated. He had built his life on a foundation of loyalty, and he had just learned that the ground beneath his feet was nothing but quicksand. He had been betrayed not by his enemies, but by his brothers, and Rose realized with a sickening certainty that a part of him had just died right in front of her. The shockwave of his confession left a ringing silence in its wake. The world narrowed to the small, dim apartment and the man unraveling before her. Rose watched as the profound pain in Oliver's eyes began to curdle, twisting into something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. His grief was being consumed by paranoia. It was a poison, and it was spreading fast. His gaze, which had been lost and broken, suddenly snapped into a terrifying focus. It landed on her. For the first time since she'd met him, his look made her truly afraid. It wasn't the look of a captor or a predator. It was the look of a man who believed he was completely surrounded by enemies, and had just found one more hiding in plain sight. How? He asked, his voice a low, menacing rasp. How did you know what to ask? How did you know to talk to Leo? How did you know Sal was the weak link? The questions were like bullets. Each one was an accusation. He was rewriting the last 48 hours, recasting her as a player, a plant, a part of the intricate betrayal designed to bring him down. The trust they had started to build was turning to ash. A sharp, unexpected pain lanced through her chest. It was one thing to be his prisoner. It was another to be his enemy. Don't, she whispered, her voice shaking with a sudden, fierce anger. Don't you dare. You show up on the same night I'm attacked. He continued, taking a step toward her, his mind now a runaway train of suspicion. You say all the right things. You point me exactly where they want me to look. It's too perfect. He was drowning in the wreckage of his life, and he was trying to pull her down with him. She wouldn't let him. Rose stood her ground, planting her feet as if to brace against a physical blow. She lifted her chin, her own fear afire in her veins. Look at me, Oliver. She used his first name, a deliberate, intimate challenge. I'm not one of them. I'm a nurse who told you she didn't want you to get killed. That is all I have ever been to you. Her words were a lifeline thrown into his storm, but he was too lost to grab it. He kept coming closer, his face a mask of torment. I can't trust anyone, he bit out, his voice raw. Not anymore. Then trust what you see. She shot back, her voice rising, cutting through his paranoia. Trust the woman who stitched your arm while your men stood guard. Trust the woman who sat with you in a cheap motel room and listened. You are not alone in this, but if you push me away now, you will be. Her defiance struck him harder than any physical blow could have. He stopped, just inches from her, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. He stared at her, his eyes searching hers, looking for the lie, for the flicker of deceit he was now certain was everywhere. He found nothing. He found only the same raw, stubborn honesty that had disarmed him in the first place. The fight drained out of him all at once. The tension in his shoulders vanished, his hands fell limply to his sides, and a stark, terrifying stillness settled over him. It was a collapse, an internal surrender. The hardened Mafia boss, the man who trusted no one, finally broke. He looked at her, his expression utterly stripped bare. The paranoia was gone, replaced by a devastating, absolute certainty. You're right, he whispered, the sound so quiet it was almost swallowed by the room. He took a shaky breath, the admission costing him everything. You're the only one. The only person in this entire godforsaken world I know for sure isn't lying to me. The confession hung between them, fragile and profound. It wasn't a declaration of affection. It was a statement of survival. In the smoldering ruins of his life, she was the only thing left standing. She was the only thing he could hold on to. She had become his anchor. The stillness that followed his confession was more terrifying than any chaos. The apartment, once a cage, had become a sanctuary, and then a tomb for the man Oliver Hayes used to be. But as the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows, Rose saw a change. The broken man was gone. In his place was someone else, someone forged in the fire of absolute betrayal. The grief was still there, a cold, hard core deep inside him, but it had been weaponized. His movements were no longer heavy with despair, they were precise, economical, and filled with a chilling purpose. He stood over a map of the French Quarter spread across the dining table, his focus absolute. He was a general planning his final battle. Rose watched him from the doorway, a mug of coffee growing cold in her hands. The air vibrated with his silent, focused rage. I'm going to end this, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the sharp finality of a blade. Tonight. Rose's heart gave a hard, painful thump. How? He finally looked up, his eyes dark and clear. The storm in them had passed, leaving behind a cold, dangerous calm. I'm going to give them exactly what they want. He tapped a single spot on the map with his finger. Me. Alone and vulnerable. A meeting to discuss my surrender. She felt the blood drain from her face. That's not a plan. That's a suicide mission. It's bait. He corrected her, his gaze unwavering. It's the only way to get them all in one place. Vincenzo, his father's men, all of them. They're too arrogant to resist the chance to see me on my knees. He described the location. A narrow, cobblestone alley that cut behind an old jazz club off Bourbon Street. She could picture it perfectly, a place slick with rain and shadows, caught between the loud, bright pulse of the city and its dark, forgotten history. The smell of stale beer and damp stone. A place where a man could disappear. My men, the few I have left, will be in position, he continued, his voice all business. But they have to see me walk in there alone. They have to believe they've won. He started gathering his things, a gun he checked with practiced efficiency, a phone he would use to make the call. He was preparing to walk into his own execution. No, Rose said, the word leaving her lips before she even thought it. He paused, turning to her with a look of cold dismissal. This is not a discussion. Yes, it is, she insisted, stepping forward, her fear consumed by a fierce, undeniable resolve. You are not doing this alone. Don't be a fool, Rose. You'll be miles away, somewhere safe. I'm not the same woman you pulled out of that hospital. She shot back, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. I have seen you at your worst. I have seen you break. I will not hide in a safe house while you walk into a trap. I won't do it. He stared at her, the absolute certainty on his face beginning to crack. He saw her not as a nurse or a victim, but as the one person who had stood by him in the wreckage. He had called her his anchor. He couldn't cut the rope now. What do you think you can do? He asked, his voice rough with a frustrated tenderness. You can't stop them. No, she agreed, her gaze locked with his. But I can make sure you don't become them. I can be there. You won't be alone. The battle of wills raged in the silent space between them. He wanted to protect her, to shove her back into the safe, orderly world she belonged in. But he knew it was too late. She was part of his world now, by her own stubborn, terrifying choice. Finally, he let out a harsh, defeated breath. Fine. He conceded, the word torn from him. You can be nearby. Hidden. Leo will be with you. But if anything goes wrong, you run. You don't look back. Do you understand me? She gave a single, sharp nod, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and triumph. He walked to the door, pulling on a dark raincoat that mirrored her own. He paused, his hand on the knob, and looked back at her. The Mafia's boss was gone. It was just Oliver, his eyes filled with 1,000 unspoken fears for her safety. But it was too late for fear. The bait was set. He opened the door, and together they stepped out into the storm. The rain fell in hard, silver sheets, turning the cobblestone alley into a river of distorted reflections. Hidden in the deep shadows of a recessed doorway, Rose's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a wild counterpoint to the distant, muffled beat of jazz from Bourbon Street. Leo stood beside her, a silent, tense statue, his hand never leaving the gun beneath his coat. From their vantage point, she could see the entire length of the alley. It was a stage set for a tragedy. Then they came. They emerged from the far end of the alley like wraiths materializing from the storm. Vincenzo was in the lead, his cousin, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He was flanked by older men, men with graying temples and expensive coats, their faces familiar to Rose from Oliver's pained descriptions. They were his father's men. His family. They moved with the lazy confidence of predators who knew their prey was already cornered. Oliver stood alone in the center of the alley, a solitary figure against the wet brick. He didn't move. He just watched them approach, the rain plastering his dark hair to his head, his hands loose at his sides. He looked impossibly calm, but Rose could feel the rage radiating from him even from across the alley, a cold, killing energy that made the air feel thin. Look at you, Oliver! Vincenzo called out, his voice echoing off the damp walls. Standing alone in the rain. The great man, brought so low. He stopped a few feet away, spreading his hands. It didn't have to be this way. But you're weak. Sentimental. You still think this city runs on honor and handshakes. It runs on blood and fear, and you've forgotten how to provide either. Another man, older, with a face like a bulldog, stepped forward. We built this for your father. We won't watch you let it crumble into dust because you don't have the stomach for what's necessary. Each word was a stone, meant to break him. Rose watched Oliver's face. It was a blank canvas of control, but she saw the muscle ticking in his jaw, the slight tightening of his hands. He was absorbing their poison, letting it fuel the fire inside him. He was on the edge. She could feel it. His right hand shifted, a barely perceptible movement, a twitch of his fingers. It was the signal. In the shadows above them, on the rooftops she couldn't see, she knew his loyal men had their targets. A bloodbath was only a breath away. She couldn't let it happen. It wasn't about them. It was about him. Before Leo could react, before she could think twice, Rose stepped out of the doorway. She walked into the rain-swept alley, the water instantly soaking her hair. She was unarmed, a small figure in a simple raincoat, and the sudden silence was deafening. The traders froze, their smug expressions turning to shock. Oliver's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and disbelief. She ignored them all. Her world narrowed to the man standing alone in the center of the storm. She walked toward him until she was standing just a few feet away, positioning herself squarely between him and his enemies. "Oliver," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of the rain. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. "Look at me." His gaze was locked on hers, a tempest of rage and betrayal swirling within them. "Don't do this," she said, her voice low but clear. "This isn't winning. This is what they want. They've been calling you a monster. Don't prove them right." He didn't speak, but his hand trembled slightly at his side. "They win if you become them," she pressed on, taking another step closer, her voice laced with a desperate urgency. "If you give that order, they've already destroyed you. The man I know, the man who listens to Etta James, the man who values loyalty above all else, is stronger than this. He is smarter than this." She raised a hand, not to touch him, but as if to hold his soul in place. "I will not stand here and watch you sacrifice yourself to your own rage. I won't abandon you to them. Win, Oliver. But win as you. Show them how wrong they are." Rose's words hung in the rain-soaked air, a fragile shield against the storm of violence about to be unleashed. She saw the war in Oliver's eyes. The raw, killing rage was there, a fire begging to be set loose. But beneath it, her words had found purchase, a single point of logic in a sea of betrayal. He was looking at her, but she knew he was seeing two futures, one drenched in the blood of his former family, and another, uncertain path she was offering him. His hand, which had been tense to give the signal, slowly, deliberately, fell to his side. The change was instantaneous. The murderous energy that had coiled in the alley seemed to dissolve into the rain. A collective, confused murmur went through the traders. Vincenzo's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Oliver took a single step forward, not toward them, but away from Rose, shielding her slightly with his body. He ignored their guns, their numbers. His gaze was fixed on Vincenzo, and his voice, when he spoke, was not the roar of a wounded animal, but the cold, quiet hiss of a serpent. "You're right, Vincenzo," he said, the words cutting through the downpour. "This city doesn't run on handshakes anymore." He let the statement hang in the air for a beat. "It runs on information." He smiled, a chilling, humorless expression that did not reach his eyes. "While you were planning your little coup, I was running my business. And I know everything. I know about the accounts Sal has been skimming for you. I know about the shipments you've been redirecting to our rivals to fund this. I know about the debts you've all incurred, thinking you were about to hit the jackpot." He began to walk slowly toward them, and for the first time, they took a step back. "You think killing me here is a victory?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "My death was never the prize. It was just a distraction." He stopped, his gaze sweeping over each of their faces, a judge passing sentence. "As of an hour ago, every offshore account you control was frozen. The evidence of your dealings with our rivals has been anonymously delivered to them. They will be very interested to know you were playing both sides. And the men you all owe money to? The ones who don't have my patience? They have been given your home addresses, your mistress's apartments, your children's schools." The color drained from their faces. Rose watched as the truth of his words sank in. He hadn't just outmaneuvered them, he had systematically erased them. He hadn't killed them. He had stripped them of their power, their money, and their safety, and thrown them to the wolves. It was a fate worse than a bullet in an alley. It was a slow, agonizing death in the world they had tried to conquer. Vincenzo stared at him, his mouth agape, the bravado completely gone. You can't." "I already have," Oliver said, his voice flat and final. "Now get out of my city." They didn't need to be told twice. Defeated not by violence but by cold, brutal logic, they scrambled away, melting back into the shadows they'd emerged from, their empire turned to dust around them. The alley was suddenly quiet, the rain softening to a gentle drizzle. The storm had broken. The immediate threat was gone. In the heavy, exhausted silence, Oliver turned to Rose. The calculating general was gone, and he looked tired, his shoulders slumping with the weight of everything he had just done. He walked toward her, his steps heavy. He stopped just before her, his gaze searching her face. "This is my life, Rose," he said, his voice raw and stripped of all pretense. "The violence. The darkness. Even when I win, this is what it looks like." He gestured to the empty, shadowed alley. "I can't promise it will ever be truly gone." He took a shaky breath. "But I can promise you this. You are the only truth I have left. My loyalty to you is absolute." He reached into his pocket, not for a gun, but for a set of car keys, and held them out to her. "There is a car waiting 2 blocks from here. It has a full tank of gas and cash in the glove box. You can go anywhere. I will have my people watch over you from a distance, ensure you are never bothered again. You can have your old life back." He paused, and his eyes held hers, filled with a desperate, fragile hope. "Or," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "you can stay. And we can try to build something new from these ruins." The choice lay between them, heavy and real. A key to her past, or a hand reaching for an uncertain future. For the first time since he'd walked into her yard, the decision was completely hers. The car keys gleamed under the dim alley light, a small, metallic promise of an escape she once would have craved. Rose looked from the keys to Oliver's face. She saw her old life reflected in that polished metal, the quiet hum of her apartment, the predictable chaos of the yard, the lonely ache for a brother she could never get back. It was safe. It was known. It was a ghost. Then she looked at the man in front of her, a man of storms and shadows who had shown her his broken soul. He was dangerous and uncertain, but he was real. She didn't reach for the keys. Instead, she took a slow step forward, closing the last bit of distance between them. The world seemed to hold its breath. She lifted her hand, not in anger or fear, but with the steady, practiced gentleness of a healer. She laid her palm flat against the rough fabric of his coat, right over his heart. She could feel its steady, heavy beat beneath her hand, a rhythm that was now as familiar as her own. It was the beat of a man who had survived. "My old life is gone," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable in the damp air. "It ended the moment you walked through my door bleeding." She looked up, meeting his intense, hopeful gaze. "I'm not that person anymore. And I am not your property to protect from a distance." She pressed her hand a little firmer against his chest, an anchor claiming its harbor. "This is my choice, Oliver. I'm staying." His shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in a profound, bone-deep relief that seemed to empty all the tension from his body. He didn't smile, but the hard lines of his face softened. He slowly raised his own hand and covered hers, his fingers lacing through her own, holding her there against his heart. The choice was made. A year later, the New Orleans sun felt warmer. Rose stood on a newly paved sidewalk, the humid air thick with the scent of fresh paint and hope. Before her stood a gleaming new building of brick and glass, a stark contrast to the weary buildings around it. A small crowd had gathered for the dedication ceremony. Rose adjusted the familiar weight of the stethoscope around her neck, its cool metal a constant reminder of who she was. A polished bronze plaque was unveiled beside the entrance. It read, "The Bennett Clinic. A Center for Healing, in memory of Thomas Bennett." Her brother's name. Tears pricked at her eyes, not of sorrow, but of a quiet, overwhelming peace. It was a wound she never thought would heal, now transformed into a place that would heal others. She felt a presence beside her, a familiar, grounding warmth. Oliver stood there, dressed in a simple dark suit, his gaze fixed on the plaque. He wasn't on the podium. He wasn't shaking hands or seeking credit. He was just there, in the background, his support a silent, unshakable force. He had turned his power, once a tool of destruction, into a gift of restoration. For her. For her brother. As the polite applause began, he turned his head, his eyes finding hers. The look that passed between them held the entire story of their stormy year. It held the memory of the alley, the shared silences, the trust forged in fire. It was a look of equals, of partners who had stared into the abyss and chosen to build something in the light. Rose reached out, her fingers finding his. The future was still unwritten, filled with risks she now willingly accepted. But it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the storm. If you enjoyed the video, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel to keep up with our content.